because in the context of people who like study this stuff and have PhDs and work in academia, there is nothing, absolutely nothing in Dan's original video that is controversial at all.
So as some of you know, over the last few days, I've had a bit of a back and forth with Dan regarding gospel authorship, and the gentleman in this video is suggesting that Dan's remarks are not controversial in the world of academia, and this is just straight up false. There are a good number of biblical scholars and philosophers of religion who would take issue with Dan's remarks. Examples of these include Craig Evans, Craig Keener, Craig Bloomberg, Brant Petra, Peter Williams, Richard Bauckham, Martin Hengel, Simon Gathercole, Mike Licona, and then of course on the more philosophical backgrounds we have people like Tim and Lydia McCrew. So why does the man in this video make this claim? Because this is what you do when you can't support your case with actual arguments. You just say, this is what everybody else thinks. You paint your opponent as this radical maverick and you accuse them of being comparable to anti-vaccine advocates, which is exactly what this guy compares me to. But I want to take a few minutes to talk about the philosophical blunders in this type of reasoning. And it's really disheartening that this level of philosophical incompetence is coming from somebody who is supposedly teaching philosophy. So let's start with this clip.
Is that there is an established and secure and overwhelming scholarly consensus. And then there is a radical minority community.
So let's first start by asking, where are you getting the data for this sociological claim from? Is there a study which has systematically surveyed scholars' views on this topic? Or is this anecdotal evidence that comes from the sphere of scholarship that you personally are surrounded by? Or is this just an isolated claim that you heard once and just ran with? Because in the opposite direction, Craig Keener is a leading scholar on Acts and has wrote one of the most comprehensive commentaries on it, ranging over 4 volumes. And in it, he notes that many scholars, probably still the majority, argue that the author of Acts was at least a short-term companion of Paul, and Keener also notes that the majority view is that Luke and Acts were written by the same person. Mike Licona, in his paper titled Are the Gospels Historically Reliable? A Focused Comparison of Suetonius' Life of Augustus and the Gospel of Mark, remarks that, quote, over the past 50 years, a slight majority of critical scholars agree with the traditional authorship of Mark, end quote. This remark came after Licona looked at a sampling of 75 opinions of critical scholars in their written works spanning from 1965 to 2018. A student of Licona's named Joshua Pelletier went on to continue this research and sampled 207 relevant scholars and reported that roughly 50% of them thought Mark is the author and that roughly 2/3 thought that the author of Mark used Peter as a source. There is a YouTube video between Licona and Pelletier in which they discuss this topic that you can find if you're really into this. My point in bringing this up is that even if you think I'm mistaken about my views regarding traditional authorship and anonymity, by no means can I be accused of being on the fringe of scholarship comparable to an anti-vaxxer. If you want to object to these remarks regarding scholarly consensus, great. Where is your source of these sociological claims? Do you have anything better than this is what one guy in grad school told you? But now let's move on to this issue, which is that a majority of scholars agreeing on something doesn't make it true or even make it reasonable. Throughout the history of biblical scholarship, or really any form of scholarship, there have been positions which the majority of scholars held, and that those positions were overturned because a few dissenters piped up and pointed out that the emperor had no clothes on. And through these criticisms, a new majority perspective was formed over time. The fact that the majority of scholars hold to a position really loses its rhetorical power once you start looking at the reasons they hold that position and you see it's built on sketchy arguments and poor assumptions. If I stand up and I point out that Dan is making really bad arguments to support his position, which he is, it does not help his case to point out that, a bunch of other people are also making the same mistake. And this leads to the final issue I want to address regarding these type of head-counting arguments. Not all biblical scholars have actually specifically studied issues surrounding gospel authorship. A biblical scholar can go to grad school, get told by his professors that this is what everybody else believes about Mark or John, and then they say, okay, and they go about their work without questioning it further. And then later, when he teaches a survey of the New Testament class, he is likely to repeat the same thing. I'm not saying this happens in every instance, but it does happen a lot. My BA was in philosophy, and my professors were great, but they did not specialize in philosophy of religion. So when they spoke on that topic, they often really butchered the material. I mean, I once had to correct my PhD holding philosophy professor on the difference between a teleological argument and a cosmological argument. They weren't dumb. They weren't being dishonest. They weren't even, I would say, in the maverick minority or something like that. They just didn't study that topic in depth and were likely just going off whatever survey course they had in grad school. all. So what they think about that topic doesn't really hold a lot of sway for me. So if you want to say, oh, the majority of scholars hold this about John and Mark and so on and so forth, okay, do they know how bad these arguments are? Have they heard the responses to these arguments?